This is Professor Chitu Okoli of Concordia University in Quebec. He co-wrote a paper entitled Business Models for Free and Open Source Software, which obviously you as a Phosphorus reader should be interested in. So, Professor Okoli, let me start with this question, which is right out of your paper's abstract. Who are the key stakeholders involved in the creation, use, and distribution of free and open source software?
Okay, well, first, thanks for inviting me to this interview. And so, as far as the key stakeholders, I guess there's different ways we could look at it. I have a particular model which looks not just at FOSS, but looks more largely at open content, all kinds of open contents. And in the framework, I look at four general kinds of stakeholders. For me, the most important are the creators. And in the case of FOSS is the developers, those who actually create the code. And so now the developers, there's different kinds of developers. Sometimes there's individual developers that might own their own project or might contribute directly to a project. Other times it's a corporate developer, meaning a company that hires developers and assigns them particular work to do. There's also bug maintainers or bug fixers. People just do little patches or so. Those are also counted as creators. So that general kind of stakeholder captures those different categories of developers. Then next are, for me, next in importance are generally the consumers in any kind of open content. In the case of FOSS, the consumers are the users. They're people who actually run the software. And my way of thinking in business, I tend to emphasize individual people more than organizations. However, so I tend to emphasize the actual users, but when an organization decides to adopt particular software, roll it out to all its employees, all its workers, then the organization should be considered a user from that perspective. And so, of course, users could be corporate users, they could be individual users, they could be government, nonprofits, and so on. So that's, first of all, the developers are the first category, the users are the second category, then the third category are what I generally call the distributors. And those are usually organizations, sometimes individuals if it's their own project, but usually an organization that plays some sort of role of getting the software and delivering it to the users. So it could be an online repository like SourceForge, that would be a distributor role. If it's a project that is hosted by a particular company, so for example, with the Android operating system, Google would be the distributor in that case, but the Google developers and other non-Google developers that contribute to it would be the developers. So that's the role of distributor. And then finally, the last category are the other stakeholders. And that's, there's all kinds of others, and sometimes they're more important, sometimes less important. Sometimes it could be investors that might have a role in funding the project. Sometimes it could be standards bodies. So if there's some particular standards that the software needs to meet to be certified for whatever reason, then that standards body would be an other scenario. And so there's a wide variety of that. And in some business models, the others are not that important. Others, they are very important. But it captures a wide variety of things that don't fit those standard first three categories.
And I can see how from project to project, there could be wide variance in the different importances, the different roles, with obviously developers almost always being on top. In fact, what about, this is a question here that's not, necessarily out of your paper, but folks, Professor Okoli was he started out in computer science. His businessness came later. So he knows whereof he speaks here. Nowadays, I mean, originally, FOSS, free software, open source software, was a creation of developers. Scratch my itch. Maybe it helps yours. More recently, has the balance changed? Do we see projects that are as much spurred by or initiated by corporates? Do we?
Well, as far as the scratch your itch, you're right that as far as on the individual level, a lot of developers, they wanted to solve a problem and they shared it with others. And from what, I mean, I'm not an expert in the early history of FOSS, but from what I understand, the early culture was by de facto a sharing culture. And developers didn't care that much about copyrights. They just cared more about helping each other. And I know it was when organizations started to become more strict about their copyrights in their software and started restricting their developers from sharing. That was one of the impetuses that pushed Richard Stallman to form a license that would give the legal framework for the developer to express their intention to keep software free. So from that perspective, even from the early stages, the corporate encroachment began. And today, now there are organization cultures that embrace FOSS, that embrace the philosophy, embraces possibilities. Probably not, when it comes to organizations, I think there's very few organizations, especially corporate or proprietary organizations that embrace the free software philosophy. Most of them that embrace FOSS take more the open source, this is better for everyone, improves the quality. They're more in the pragmatic aspect rather than caring more about users' rights to use the software. So
you're saying they're more interested in the development model than in the freedom portion.
That's my take. I cannot even name an organization. Well, I mean, there are a few small organizations. Like I know there's some that create free operating systems and complete free hardware that has complete free software. There are a few small organizations that do embrace and try to maintain a free philosophy, but most of the organizations, the large organizations that are known for promoting FOSS, I think take the more pragmatic open source philosophy rather than the more philosophical software freedoms. So as far as the goal, so that's one aspect of my, another aspect of the framework I have. And I recognize there's 4 very common goals that different stakeholders might have. Not all stakeholders have them, but you see this in almost any business model. The first I would call money. For the organization that's receiving it, it's revenue. For the people who are paying for it, is price. And of course, money, I strongly believe money is the root of all evils. In order to fund a developer, especially if that's their full-time professional work, they need to make a living. And so the question is, where does that funding come from? That's a very key issue in any business model. And on the flip side, consumers often, or users naturally try to pay the least price they can. And in the case of FOSS, where you can always get the software free, that is at no price, not in the FOSS, but at no price, then it's very easy to not give the developers any revenue. So the very fascinating and challenging aspect of FOSS business models is how do you get the revenue to sustain the quality development that everyone wants. And a lot of it, of course, people, not for this audience, but people who are not that familiar with FOSS think that, okay, it's free, it costs nothing, But in fact, especially from a corporate perspective, if you are going to adopt FOSS, there's always a total cost of the transaction. It needs to be maintained, installed, improved, and so on. And the business proposition is that it's a much lower total cost than if you have to pay software licenses on top of that. But then a lot of that total cost of ownership is where the revenues do come in, maybe hiring people to improve it. Though the other major aspect of revenue is just the cost savings from licenses that don't have to be paid, from developers that don't have to build things from scratch. So a lot of the money that is saved from that is diverted to paying the developers that do work on the FOSS. Interestingly, one of the models, maybe not exactly the same thing, but one of the models is certification of FOSS, whereby a certifying body can certify the FOSS is of certain standards, and the organizations that want that certified pay that revenue, and so that sustains the production of that quality software. And I keep coming back to quality because for me, quality is actually the most important goal, meaning that people want quality software. You want good quality stuff. And people might want something, you don't pay for it, but you want good quality. And so every business model, the whole goal is not just how to produce software, but how do you sustain the quality. And it's not just the quality of the initial versions, but how do you keep it continually improved, whether adding features, fixing bugs, and so on. So that is the primary goal that is shared by almost every stakeholder.